Hi, everybody. It's Imran Ahmed, founder and CEO of the Business of Fashion. Welcome to a crash course on the BOF Sustainability Index 2022. This is an event that we have decided to do every year just as we launch and release our highly anticipated index on basically tracking the progress of the global fashion industry against some clear targets that are important for all of us to be aware of, as you know, we obviously want our industry to make progress against sustainability goals in a wide variety of categories. And I'm very thrilled today to welcome two of my colleagues who have been the two real driving forces of the index this year. First, we have Diana Lee, the Director of Research and Analysis at the Business of Fashion. Diana has played an instrumental role in putting the index together with her counterpart in our newsroom, Chief Sustainability Correspondent Sarah Kent. Between the two of them, they have overseen a massive expansion of the index this year. We have doubled the scope of the index from 15 companies to 30 companies. And we've had to recalculate all of our scores from the 2021 index to enable year-on-year comparisons for the original cohort of 15 companies that appeared last year. And for those of you who were not part of or not aware of our index from last year, you should know that our findings last year was that the industry was not making a lot of progress on the targets that we had set. To this year, I have to say, we are finding a similar theme. And now that we've added 15 more companies, the results are quite stark. So today we plan to cover all of this and more. And with Sarah and Diana's help, I believe that we'll have an excellent overview, a crash course into the index, because there's a lot of data. There's 200 data points across 6 categories and 30 companies. So there's a lot to understand. But before we dive in, I just want to welcome all of you joining us from around the world. If you are joining us, we are using a new platform today. We have started working with a company called Brand Live. And so if you're not familiar with how this tool works, it's quite similar to all of the kind of Zoom or Teams or Google Meeting calls. I'd love to hear where you're all joining us from today. So in the right-hand side of the screen, in the chat, let us know where you're joining from. Usually we had more than almost 4,000 people register for this event from all around the world. And we're absolutely delighted to welcome you all here today. So Sarah and Diana, let me know first. So, what was the ambition of the index this year? Why does the industry need this kind of tool? Sarah, I'll go to you first. Just give us a sense. It was actually your idea to create this index way back, almost like 2.5 years ago now. What are we learning from a tool like this?
Yeah, I mean, so the reason why we had the idea to do this in the first place was that I was writing about sustainability at BOF, and increasingly companies were coming out with big ambitious things that they wanted to do, but it was really hard to understand what progress was being made towards those targets, or also to compare how what one company was saying it wanted to do stacked up against what another company was doing, and really understand, it's great that we've got a capsule collection of made from recycled materials, or that there is a 2050 goal for carbon neutrality, but understanding what was happening on the ground in practice to demonstrate progress was really, really difficult. So we wanted to take the time to take a deeper dive into what companies were doing to enable us to benchmark progress, make like-for-like comparisons, and really understand if we as an industry are setting these really very ambitious goals to improve how we operate from the standpoint of responsibility, how are we doing on that, and where are the opportunities to do better and the challenges that still remain. So that was the goal, and I think that's a really, really important thing to look at, especially given that if you look at this decade, it's a really important moment to make a number of changes if we are to meet global climate goals. So it's very important that the industry acts now. And hopefully this is a useful tool for everyone to look at, to understand where we're at and where more action needs to be taken.
Well, Sarah, what happens if we don't meet these goals?
From a climate standpoint, what the way we frame this is we're looking at the fact that the UN has said that by 2030, the world across industries needs to radically slash emissions if we are to stand a chance of avoiding catastrophic climate change. So, from the biggest picture, for the industry to do its part to stave off real disaster, we need to take these steps. And then from a more philosophical standpoint, if you look at the way consumer culture is diverting, where there's a real expectation on companies that they stand behind the values they are promoting in the way they operate. And I think we all want to be part of an industry that is operating ethically and treating the people who work in its supply chain in a way that is responsible and avoiding labor abuses. I think it's harder to sort of say there will be a massive disaster if that doesn't happen by 2030, but it shouldn't have to have that kind of a stuff. It should just be a baseline.
Yeah. Now a question for everyone watching at home or at work or at school. Like, let us know why you're joining this chat today, why you're joining this conversation. Do you work in the sustainability space? Are you just a curious consumer? Are you a student at school? If you let us know what you're looking for to help us to kind of guide the conversation towards meeting your goals. While I'm tracking your responses in the chat, I'm going to turn it over to Diana. We made some changes to the index this year. Can you talk a little bit about how we collected the data, what changed versus last year, and how you analyzed and crunched the data to come up with the findings?
Sure, absolutely. And Sarah will definitely have something to add about this, as she spearheaded the research stage in terms of gathering the various data points. And she led our fierce team of researchers to pore over thousands of documents to be able to look at the public disclosures. So one thing to note about the 30 companies that are contained within the index this year is that they are all publicly listed, and that public disclosures is very important for us to be able to see what is actually being reported and to be able to measure that on an objective footing. Because if you think about it, disclosures can be very inconsistent. And that really gets to the heart of what Sarah was just saying, which is that it's difficult for people to make an apples to apples comparison. So that's why our index is coming in. And so we spent months actually gathering the different data points. We had over 200 metrics that were applied to all 30 of the different companies. And essentially these were binary metrics. So either there's a yes or a no response. And the yes is if a company fulfilled that criteria, and a no is if it didn't. And so the calculation for the company is essentially how many yeses there were over the total number of questions. And we looked at 6 sustainability categories, which I'll go into a little bit more detail later on. But kind of the way to think about this is that we took those scores, and then that's how we looked at those scores across all 6 of those categories, and that's how we derived an overall index score.
So Sarah, why don't you add to that? And you were obviously very involved in the creation of the index last year and this year. What are if you're going to summarize like super high level findings for people, what did we learn this year that we didn't know last year?
So what we found is you have a small number of companies who, generally speaking, are the largest companies that are therefore highest profile and face the most scrutiny, who are showing signs of incremental progress. But by expanding the number of companies we looked at from 15 to 30, in most cases, almost across the board, we found outcomes were worse. So companies that face a little bit less scrutiny or coming under a little bit less attention are really engaging in a very, very limited way with these topics at all. And there were several areas where we found multiple companies scored no points whatsoever. So they're just disclosing nothing to indicate that they are looking at that particular issue.
To be clear, so when a company scores 0, it doesn't necessarily mean they're doing nothing. It means they're disclosing nothing. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes. This is all based on public disclosure. So that it means that as an individual interested in the company, whether you are a consumer who wants to understand, I have certain values that I want to consume in line with, so let me understand if this company is in line with my values, or if you are, like us, a media company interested in understanding what a company is doing, or, a potential business partner, there is no public information that would enable you to understand what the company is doing in that space. They may be doing other stuff behind the scenes, but it's not transparent.
Okay. Well, before we continue in the Q&A, I think maybe Diana, it'd be helpful to just get, for those people who haven't had a chance yet to download and read all the information, to get a sense of the overall, findings from the report. So maybe you could just walk us through those findings now.
Absolutely. So we will pull up that presentation. Thank you so much, Neve. And so it's just sometimes easier to show rather than just to tell. And so thank you again for joining us to our session today, and welcome to looking at a short extract from our 2022 Sustainability Index report. And so this is our second edition. We're very proud of it. And it is also the first time that this report falls under the BOF Insights umbrella. So for those of you that are joining us today, I assume that you're very familiar with the business of fashion, but you might be less familiar with BOF Insights because it is a relatively new team. It's only about a year old. And essentially with BOF Insights, we try to arm business and creative and fashion leaders with the data that they need in order to make better decisions. And so our research tends to be much more quantitatively driven and longer form than our journalism. And this is why the format this year for the 2022 edition of the Sustainability Index will look so different from what you may have seen from the inaugural edition last year. So with all that being said, we will dig into some of those high-level findings. All right, so we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this really was a Herculean effort. It took a team of researchers over a course of months to be able to pour together over all of the public disclosures for those 30 different companies. And you'll see that we talk a little bit about the methodology before we go into the results of the index of all 30 of those companies. And then we provide the substantiating detail behind each of those. So for example, we'll talk about how performance looked like across the 6 sustainability categories, which we'll go into a little bit more detail in the next slide. And then we also have the 30 individual company profiles. So as we mentioned a little bit earlier, we have doubled the scope from 15 companies last year to 30 companies in this year's Sustainability Index. And these were the 30 largest publicly listed companies in the fashion industry. So we relied wholly on public disclosures. And they roughly split into equal contributions to the annual revenues. So in total, these 30 companies were basically about $340 billion in annual revenues. And this was evenly split pretty much across luxury, high street, as well as sportswear. And then we will move on now just to give you a little bit more detail about the actual structure of the report. So we've alluded to the sustainability categories a few times now. So that is essentially our 6 categories, which are emissions, transparency, water and chemicals, materials, workers' rights, and waste. And there are essentially 16 targets that sit underneath these 6 categories. And so you can look into this in more detail in the full report, but I'll give you a little bit of a teaser, which is essentially that there is one target that sits under emissions, and that's basically about reducing your absolute greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030, whereas there are 2 targets that sit underneath transparency, and that is really about having full traceability across the supply chain by the end of 2022, as well as publicly disclosing environmental and social impacts across the supply chain also by 2022. And then if we keep going down a layer, so from categories to targets to the binary metrics, this is what I was talking to Imran a little bit about earlier in the session, which is just about how we actually calculated the score for the companies. So there are 200 questions that were either yes or no responses. And so over the course of our research, we could gather whether a company actually fulfilled the criteria to obtain a yes. And so essentially a company would gain a point if they scored a yes. And so this is how we calculated the scores for all the different categories. And the average of those categories is how we arrived at a company score. So that's just to give you a little bit of background. And I will also talk a little bit about the context. So very early on in the session, Sarah talked about how important 2030 is as a deadline. So obviously it's the end of the decade, and it's also the deadline for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we really aligned our sustainability index to those UN SDGs, so the Sustainable Development Goals. And essentially, we only have about 8 years left to achieve that set of sustainability goals. And so you can also view our index as a tracker and as a proxy for the overall fashion industry in terms of how well we are doing in terms of transforming sustainable business practices in order to be able to hit those 2030 milestones. And you can see is that overall our score is it's a pretty poor showing across the 30 companies. So they only achieved a score of 28 out of a total possible number of 100 points. And so the overall takeaway is that this is progress that is much too slow, and it's really endangering the 2030 goals. And it's really going to be incumbent on the fashion industry to meaningfully engage with sustainability goals. Okay, and then moving on. So one of the nuances of the 2022 Sustainability Index that we've alluded to a couple times now is that we expanded our scope from 15 companies to 30 companies. And so what that means is that the 2021 Sustainability Index isn't a direct comparison to the 2022 index because you've doubled the number of companies. So the nuance to this is that we actually did the analysis of all 30 companies within the 2022 index, and we also split it into its constituent parts. So we looked at the original cohort that makes up basically 15 companies that were also a part of the 2021 index. And we also have a separate cohort, which is looking at just the 15 new companies that were added. And Sarah mentioned this a little bit earlier at the beginning of the presentation, but essentially there was a pattern that was very clear to us and emerged, which essentially is that there is a big disparity between the companies that were part of the original cohort versus the companies that were newly added this year. And this is because, again, of the way in which we chose our companies that appeared in the Sustainability Index. So we essentially went down the list of the companies in terms of their size of annual revenues. And so in the 2021 index, those were the biggest companies. And this year, when we added our 15 new companies, we went a tier down in terms of annual revenues. And so Sarah mentioned that we have a hypothesis that it's very likely that this new rung of companies have been able to escape some of the scrutiny that has been applied very heavily by the public and by other stakeholders to those frontrunners, or they may just have fewer resources that they can actually allocate to sustainability objectives. So there are a number of different hypotheses, but you can see that there's a very clear performance difference where in that overall score of 28, when we break it out, the score for the original cohort is 36 points, whereas for the new additions, the score that they obtain is only 20. So there's a 16-point gap between the two. And on the right-hand side of the chart, we have a bit more information in terms of key statistics. So we can see that the highest score was 49, and that was achieved by Puma. The most improved company, meaning that it was both in the 2021 index as well as in the 2022 index, was Fast Retailing, and that company increased by 11 points. And then finally, we had 4 companies that beat the newcomer trend. So this is what we're talking about, where the new additions tended to do worse than the companies that were part of the original cohort. And so, and in this case, these 4 newcomers beat the trend, and so they all continue to rank in the top half of the 2022 index. And those 4 companies were Burberry, which came in 5th, Lululemon, which came in 11th, Next, which was 13th, and Ralph Lauren, which was 15th. And so this, I hope, will just drive home the point that the progress is much too slow. So we had rebased our 2021 index score. So we had streamlined our number of metrics, and we basically recalculated the 2021 index score. And so that was 31. And we compared it to the 15 companies that were part of the original cohort. So that was the score of 36 that we saw just in the last slide. And you can see that there's very incremental progress. It's only an increase of 5 points. And so if we continue to grow at that pace over the next 8 years until 2030, you can see that it would be impossible to fulfill our 2030 goals. So there's quite the shortfall. And this is really why the fashion industry needs to feel that fire and needs to get that urgency in terms of really doubling down on both existing sustainability initiatives as well as creating new ones that are going to make meaningful changes. All right, so now going on to the 6 sustainability categories, which are our impact categories. This is a very simple visual. It's basically just a scoreboard, and so it's ranked in descending order in terms of the performance of the categories. And you can see that emissions was the highest at 38 points, and then waste was the lowest at 19 points. Obviously, when I say, best performing, it's all relative because you can still see that there's a lot of white space because the total number of possible points is 100. And so clearly there is much room for improvement across every single one of these categories. And one thing I do want to mention as well is that when we added the 15 new companies, in general, that dragged down all of the scores across the categories. And the only exception was emissions. So emissions was the only one where the score this year is actually still higher than it was the previous year. But again, keeping in mind that it's not an apples to apples comparison because there were 15 companies in last year's index and there are 30 this year. But it's still telling as an example to show just how much the newcomers can drag down the overall index scores. Now, this is an infographic that I'm going to end on for the presentation, and then we'll switch back into the session with Imran and Sarah. And this is an infographic that I hope will be familiar to those of you that follow our articles online as well as follow us on social media. And essentially, this is a quite busy graphic, so I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but I will at least point out some of the high-level takeaways. So essentially, this is a list of all 30 companies that are contained within the index, and it's arranged in descending order. So we've got Puma as our top company in terms of score, all the way down to the bottom, which is HLA. And it shows the performance that every company achieved in a specific impact category, and then how those 6 categories then average out into the overall score for that company. So some things just to note here is that Puma is our number 1. It has displaced Nike, which was last year's index leader. And Kering and H&M actually have stayed in the same spot. So Kering was number 2 for both years of the index, and H&M was number 4 in both years of the index. Levi's was formerly in the 5th place, and it's moved into 3rd place this year. And the thing about Nike is that because of changes in disclosure, it actually dropped, and that's why it lost its 1st place. So these are just kind of very high-level statistics, a whirlwind tour of a lot of information. So with all of our 200 metrics applied across 30 companies with 2 years of data for some of them, we ended up with over 9,000 data points. And so there's a lot more to be had from the whole report. So I hope that all of you will take the time to actually peruse the full report in detail.
Thank you so much, Diana. That was like a really quick whistle-stop tour through the report. I mean, for anyone who's interested in downloading the full report, that is available from BOF Insights, and our team will share a link in the chat so that you can have a look at that full report. But let's move on to get a bit more of a deep dive into the index. Sarah, the results are kind of depressing, if I'm honest. When I look at it, we have the industry constantly talking about sustainability. It's in all the headlines. I mean, even at BOF, we must receive like 10 press releases a day that use the word sustainability or responsibility or, environmentally conscious. Why is the pace of progress so slow?
That's a really complicated question. And I think there's lots of different elements to it. It's easy to sort of give a really negative throwaway answer, which is just, this is all just marketing and companies are talking about it because they know that it's a compelling way to draw in consumers now, but they're not really acting behind it. I think it's much more complicated than that. What we're talking about is really hard. It's, were companies to really achieve the targets we set, which are very ambitious ones, we're talking about real systems change. And that doesn't happen overnight. It's not easy and it's not linear. So although we're seeing only incremental progress, the fact that we're seeing progress is significant. And, I applaud the companies that are making moves and and talking about what they are doing. Fundamentally, some of the major stumbling blocks are that this needs money. It needs money that will go into things that will likely pay off long term, but may not pay dividends near term, and will not probably do it at an individual level. So it requires investment, collaboration, and cooperation on a scale that is really, really hard to coordinate from, as an individual company or even from an industry level. So in short, this is really hard, and that's part of the reason why we're not seeing so much progress.
So are you optimistic?
Yes, I am actually. I think there are a number of things that we're seeing continue to shift that could be quite transformative. And a big part of that, and as part of this report, we've identified kind of 5 key themes that we think are going to shape the landscape over the next 12 to 18 months, bearing in mind this is very long term as a whole. But one of them is the role of regulation. And I think that having lawmakers step in with clear policies and incentives to give companies a direction of travel can really unlock some of the change that we're looking for. So in the EU in particular at the moment, there is a very big series of policy coming through the pipeline, specifically focused on the textile industry, that is intended to encourage a more circular industry, that is intended to create more robust standards for what it means to say they're operating sustainably. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to change everything overnight, but I do think it will enable a lot more transformation than we've seen so far, and it will require companies that perhaps have not been engaging to do so. So we'll create a more level playing field as well.
Understood. Well, why don't we dive into some of the categories? Like, where Sarah, Diana, where are we seeing the kind of progress we need to see?
Sarah, I'm happy to start, and then please do add on. So, if I think about the categories that did relatively well, granted, you take it with a grain of salt because, again, all the categories, there's still a substantial gap to reach the 100, but there were two categories that did reach the 30s, and so that was emissions number one and transparency number two. So, I'll talk briefly about those two categories, and then I'd love to turn it over to Sarah. So, for emissions, early on when I showed the actual presentation, I alluded to the fact that when we added the new rung of companies, the 15 new additions, that actually dragged down the score across the board for every category with the exception of emissions. And I think what is really notable about emissions is that there's a relatively clear framework and guidance. And so that is why companies have actually been able to follow that kind of guidance in terms of target setting. So on one hand, that's good because a lot of the points have been obtained for target setting, but at the same time, there's the next step, which is then reporting on the results. And that is really where I think that next push needs to come from the companies when it comes from emissions and around the disclosure. And then on transparency, I just wanted to say that this is our second best category in terms of performance. And part of that is actually related to emissions because with transparency, it's about disclosure around a variety of topics from emissions to water to chemicals and the like. And honestly, a lot of the performance that was done very well within transparency is actually related to emissions. And so there's sort of a kind of halo effect as well on transparency because of how well companies have been doing on emissions. At the same time, there still remains substantial gaps in performance because companies are not doing the same when it comes to disclosure and traceability when it comes to the other sustainability topics like water and chemicals and waste. And so within that, there's very mixed performance. So that's how I would summarize emissions and transparency. And Sarah, I'm sure you'll have a lot more to add as well.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, and that's reflected in what you just said, Diana, is it's pretty clear now what kind of targets companies need to be setting and the goals they need to be moving towards. And that's why we're seeing a lot of progress, which is not nothing, because I think 3 or 4 years ago, you would not have seen this level of engagement with the issues at all. However, what it is really important to start to see in a much more robust manner is companies moving beyond target setting to real action. And that is a really open question mark as to the extent to which we'll see that. As I said, I don't think it's going to be linear. There will be areas where there are more obvious, easy steps, not easy, there are more obvious steps that you could take now, and there will be areas where new technologies are going to be needed to really solve this. But that will be the big question mark for next year. Are we going to see companies really starting to move the needle and taking measurable and demonstrable steps?
Understood. So go ahead, Diana.
Sorry, and Sarah just made me think of the other point, which is that even with emissions, it feels that companies are sometimes taking the easy route, which is they're setting targets when it comes to their emissions from their own supply chains. But we all know that the majority of fashion companies do not own their factories. And so that is a kind of a level beyond them. And so that's your scope 3 emissions. And so if we look at the target setting, more than 2/3 of companies have set targets when it comes to emissions from their own supply chain. However, that drops down to less than half when it comes to the overall emissions from the rest of the value chain. So this is, again, sort of, companies need to rise to the occasion and do what's hard, not just what's easy and the low-hanging fruit.
So, we've talked a little bit about the areas where, in transparency and emissions where, there's more progress. It's quite concerning to see some of the areas where the industry is vastly underperforming, like waste and workers' rights. What are the blockers there? First, let's talk about waste, Sarah, because that's traditionally been like the worst performing category. Why is it so poor?
That's a good question. I think part of it is that waste is actually an area that the industry is quite new to addressing. It's really only in the last couple of years that we started to have the phrase circularity emerge as a buzzword, and that's really attached to exciting new models like resale e-commerce and rental that have sprung up and really got people very excited. And that is something that the industry can point to and get excited about because there are clear ways to make money through them. And circularity then becomes this very nice buzzword that you can use to sort of say, hey, I want to engage with resale and rental, and I'm going to create a circular business model, and I'm dealing with my impact because clothes are going to be going through the system in a closed loop rather than ending up in landfill. But the reality is that for most traditional brands, those types of models are ones they're just beginning to experiment with. If they're dabbling at all, it's something they're looking at, so that the beginning of the journey there. And really, those are only one part of a much bigger conversation around the issue fashion faces when it comes to waste, both in terms of the volume of clothes we're producing and the waste created at the production phase, and then what happens to the clothes at end of life. And really, we don't have good solutions to either of those issues yet. And it really gets the heart of this fundamental tension that exists within any conversation about fashion and sustainability, which comes down to the purpose of a fashion company is to sell things to people. And if the industry is really going to operate more sustainably, probably it needs to make fewer things. And so waste is this actually really, really tricky issue to grapple with.
Yeah, I mean, it's this conversation I had with François-Henri Pinault, last year around this time, Sarah, when I asked him this question and said, you're a publicly traded company, as every company in our index is, by the way. They're measured on growth of revenue and growth in profit. And I said, by definition, every single product you create has an impact. And as an industry, we're focusing on marketing to people to consume more things and driving a system of overproduction, which leads to excess amounts of waste. Are there smarter ways for companies to think about meeting their financial goals and the expectations of the market and doing things in a way that's less wasteful, more targeted? Or is this system that we're operating in just fundamentally an unsustainable system?
I mean, it's a really philosophical question. I'm sure everyone will have slightly different views on this. I think fundamentally, from a system point of view, it is unsustainable. But I also think that we don't have to be ascetics. We don't have to be perfectionists about this. We have to get better, and we have to keep getting better and keep pushing to get better. And business models like resale or rental, where instead of creating a new product, you can generate financial gain from reusing something that's already in the system, hold out one really promising route towards continuing to generate value in a traditional shareholder way, whilst also using fewer virgin resources. There are also new technologies that there's a lot of investment going into that will enable us to turn old clothes into raw materials that could be used again. So again, once more, we're taking less virgin resource from the planet to create new things, which is another sign of progress. And I think there is an element of this that is cultural and finding ways to engage with your customer base or your community that is not necessarily about consumption. We see, it's really interesting in some of the conversations we have outside of this aspect of sustainability in the industry that just looks at how the fashion model is changing to become much more about creating a brand that transcends just what is being sold, to create an idea of a community and creating value for that community. And I think that also holds a lot of opportunity and value to build something that is not just about extracting resources and selling stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, what Mr. Pino said to me was something that I found, it's been kind of resonating in my head now for about a year, which is actually, as an industry, we need to make fewer things of higher quality that last longer. And it's, and that applies at the luxury level, and it applies at the kind of, mass market level. And we see that across the board in our index, Diana, the mass market companies in sportswear or high street and the luxury companies, they're all facing these problems. There's not a really big difference between them.
Mm-hmm. And before we move on to that point about looking at segments, though, Imran, I did want to just add one thing about the waste and the overproduction, because this is actually the last topic that BOF Insights looked at when we were assessing fashion supply chain. Because with the fashion supply chain, that was definitely a topic that we were discussing with a lot of different external experts, just about that culture of overconsumption, which it is detrimental to the bottom line, because what it results in is a lot of discounting. And so we were speaking to different external experts, and they were talking about what are some of the alternative models that you can have to try to minimize the waste. And it can actually start as early as the design stage in terms of how you think about pattern cuts, and then how you actually sew to minimize the fabric waste. So it's not just talking about the actual textile waste that comes when consumers want to discard their clothing because they've grown out of it or they don't like it anymore. It's actually going all the way back to the design stage. And there's also things about some companies now are beginning to experiment more with the storage of raw materials versus finished goods. And so when you have that kind of warehouse, it becomes much more flexible, because you can use that kind of fabric and say, okay, well, it doesn't have to become this pair of trousers. It could become a dress instead. So that's another way to minimize the overconsumption that we see in the industry. And then finally, one of the kind of thought experiments we did in the supply chain report was actually about looking about how, if you can reduce the amount of discounting that happens to the inventory, then you actually improve your product margins. So there's a number of ways that the industry can tackle it. Just the issue is, how do we do it at scale? But it feels like there are a number of different solutions that are being explored on top of the resale and the rental and the repair that companies are beginning to start trialing. It's just a matter that right now it seems like it's a little bit more hype than actual substance, because it will take time for that to actually become embedded and for that operationally to reach a stage where it's going to have a meaningful impact on inventories.
Got it. So what about workers' rights, Sarah? This is the other low performing category where, consistently we've seen reports in the media about, factories with poor conditions. During the pandemic, we saw luxury workers creating like highly desirable, artisanal products in India, losing their jobs. I mean, what's the update on workers' rights?
So also one of the worst performing areas of the index, which is really disheartening, because this is a topic that has been a big focus for the industry for decades, long before there was the awareness we have now around environmental issues. Fashion was facing a lot of criticism for poor working conditions in its supply chain, and really not a huge amount seems to have changed. We still are relying on a system of self-regulation, essentially, to manage supply chains that are very fragmented and therefore difficult to oversee, and that enables workers' abuses to go undetected. And similarly, and I think this really is the crux of the fundamental issue, there is a disconnect between the financial motivations of brands who's want to get the best product at the lowest price, and the reality of the price that is needed to secure good working conditions and fair wages for people within the supply chain. And that has not been resolved.
Diana, anything to add there?
Yeah, what was interesting as well about the workers' right category is that it actually had one of the worst performing targets. And so the worst performing target reached an average score of only 10, and that was around equitable purchasing practices. And that was all about ensuring ethical working conditions, which is, again, I think very surprising, because if you think about just the last 2 years with the pandemic, there has been more focus on things like living conditions and ensuring that workers were safe and protected. And yet when we look at the evidence, that this was the worst performing score. So it feels difficult to reconcile those two.
Okay. Well, Sarah and Diana, we have a lot of questions coming through on the chat, and I'm going to try to run through some of them by kind of editing them down, because there's a lot of them. I'm wondering here, someone is asking about educating the customer. What role companies have to play. If we're operating in the system of overconsumption, where we're buying more and more things, what role do companies have to play in terms of educating the customer to buy better?
I think it's a big responsibility for the industry. And I think that's a difficult one, because there is a fundamental tension as well between that level of education and perhaps the more traditional form of marketing that the industry would engage in, which is just to encourage people to buy a tool. So it's encouraging to see that companies are putting more effort into explaining different sustainability initiatives. I think that it shouldn't just fall to companies to do this work, though. That again goes back to this idea of self-governance or self-regulation. There has to be, I think, more critical parties looking at what is going on and assessing that from an independent standpoint, rather than just allowing the companies to present what they're doing. So, I think it is, we're seeing amazing consumer activism taking place now. I think that's fantastic. That's really moving the needle in terms of the conversation. We're seeing more reporting in the media around different things that's going on within fashion industry and what could or could not constitute sustainability. That's fantastic. Regulation will help too. And then also the way companies talk to consumers. I think it's all of these things.
Another question that's come through here from Francesca Magri is to understand why companies like Puma and H&M in particular. I saw a lot of questions about this on social media when people saw our ranking, Diana and Sarah, which is like a company like H&M, which is operating in this, fast fashion model. How come they have performed relatively well in the BOF Sustainability Index?
So sorry, Diana, you go. No, you go ahead.
Well, I'll just make it very short, which is, again, the caveat is that we rely wholly on public disclosures. And so once again, this goes back to this disclaimer we made at the very beginning of the presentation, which is even if a company doesn't disclose, it doesn't mean that they're not working on it. So this is not to say that H&M is doing a ton of stuff and they're amazing and Ralph Lauren or Burberry or Kering, et cetera, are not doing it. It's just that within the public disclosures, that information was not presented to the same level. So that's the first caveat. And then Sarah, over to you.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So this is a methodology based on what companies say publicly. So I think, H&M, Puma, Levi's, Kering, Burberry, the candidates within the index, they have all been engaging with these topics and publishing reports about what they're doing for several years. So their disclosures within the canon of what the industry discloses are relatively sophisticated, which helps them get higher points. They provide information about what they're doing across all the categories that we're looking at, and they do provide some level of data for us to then draw from. A lot of other companies that scored more poorly don't provide that information. And then the other element that I think is really interesting when it comes to this conversation about sustainability is that there is a lot of almost snobbiness around this. There's an assumption that if a company is luxury, it must be operating at a more responsible level. And there's a degree to which I think that argument stands in that luxury products tend to be more durable, tend to have a higher quality. However, I think all companies now, particularly when we're talking about the size of companies that we look at in the index, are producing mass amounts of products, very high volumes, and are facing the similar challenges. And certainly what we found when we look at it by different market segment was you have some very high performers and some very low performers in almost all of the segments. And whether you're a luxury brand, a mass market brand, or a sportswear brand, or company rather, doesn't really determine whether or not you are engaging publicly to a large degree with these issues, which I think is interesting.
Anything to add there, Diana?
Well, since we're talking about that segment performance, it might be helpful to bring up a few charts as well. So Neve, perfect. Thank you so much. So this is what Sarah was just talking about. And again, kind of in the interest of showing rather than just telling you, just so that's very clear to everybody. So this is what Sarah was referring to about how the spread of the scores within each of the different segments. So we looked at 3 market segments. There are luxury, high street, and sportswear. And just as a reminder, the overall average score in the index was 28. So relative to that, luxury did slightly better. So that was a score of 31. And then high street and sportswear were just below, so coming in at 27 and 26 points respectively. But you can see that there's still quite a large spread within all the different companies. So this is not to say that, again, luxury is doing that much better. I think they're all kind of comparably, I mean, in all honesty, all of these companies could be doing much more, and all of the segments could be doing much more. And you can see that as well, because if you just look at the axes, we're not even looking at an axis of 100. We stopped it at 50 because the highest score was Puma. And so there's not any company that even exceeded that halfway point of progress. And so this is concerning. And then we hope that in future iterations of the index, when we track progress, we can actually see companies that are going to do better than that. But really, this is just to show that kind of segments are an interesting way to look at it, but within the segment performance, there's still much more that needs to be done. And then there's just a little bit more information just to kind of visually show in a different way how you can cut the data. So just by luxury, high street, and sportswear, you can see how the different companies rank. And so we have our number one company, which is Puma at 49. So it's obviously also topping sportswear. Kering was number 2 overall on the index, so it tops the luxury ranking. And then Levi Strauss was 3rd overall in the index, and so it comes in first for high street. So this is just a helpful way to be able to look at the information. Thank you, Neve.
So tons of questions here. A lot of people are asking about the Higg index, Sarah, and there's obviously been a controversy around the accuracy of that, especially when it relates to materials. So someone's asking, what are your criteria for materials? Curious to what materials you would consider as more sustainable than others, as it is super complex. I think the Higg index, for example, if I recall correctly, considers some kinds of polyester as sustainable, even though their polyester is created from fossil fuels, which are obviously damaging to the planet. I mean, how do we get around this materials question?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question. I think it's one there's a really healthy debate going on about right now that is driving everyone in a much better direction. What Higg does is it's a methodology it uses life cycle analyses to understand the impact of different materials. And what the LCAs have found, because of the way their methodology works, that in some cases, polyester may have a better LCA score than some natural fibers, which is surprising to many, because polyester is obviously based off a fossil fuel, which is oil. And it speaks to some of the complexity around all of this conversation, because what is the appropriate framework to measure good, and what methodology should we be using? I'm not going to get into Higg right now, but that's sort of just to frame this conversation. So the way we have approached this is we're not creating an assessment of whether a specific material is good or bad. When we look at, we have 3 targets relating to materials. The first just asks whether companies are taking steps to source what are called preferred materials by next year. So it's very near term. And preferred materials we are defining as any kind of material that has been certified by an external body to be better than the conventional version. So anything like an organic cotton or a BCI cotton or a certified recycled polyester would fit within that criteria. And the goal there is just to measure whether companies are starting to make progress on this journey of finding ways to replace conventional materials with ones that have a lower impact on the planet. We then have 2 longer term, more ambitious targets. The first being a goal for companies to transform their entire natural raw material supply chain to regenerative practices. So the idea being that over the course of the next decade, companies will move from buying whatever natural fibers they are buying just on the market, and really drilling down into their supply chain to understand that if they are buying cotton, it is from a farm that has been managed responsibly from an environmental and social standpoint, and that is not only doing less harm to the soil and biodiversity health, but actually having a positive impact. That is the goal. And for the third target is around polyester. And so if you are still going to use synthetic fibers, the goal is that they will be fully circular by 2030. So that's how we're approaching it. It's less sort of looking at individual fibers that companies are using and saying this fiber is good and this fiber is bad, and more from a holistic standpoint of what is the end goal that we would like to get to.
Sarah, what about mycelium? Someone here has said, mycelium is also a new fabric that can revolutionize the industry. Do you agree with that?
I think mycelium is a really interesting and potentially revolutionary material. We're a long way from getting to the scale where it could revolutionize the industry yet. I think at the moment it's still at sort of the disruptive force level. And I think there's also a conversation that is going to continue happening around many of these new innovations as to what their impact are. So many of the mycelium products that we're seeing come to market do still contain some elements of plastic, not all of them. But this is a big challenge that new material alternatives still need to overcome, that in many cases, to ensure quality and aesthetic and durability, you need to add some polymer materials to them still, so that they're not often fully natural. And I think there's also a nuance around the obvious positive benefits of embracing new innovations, but also the importance of ensuring a just transition where we're not, destroying livelihoods and jobs in our eagerness to jump onto an exciting new product.
So we're going to run out of time soon. It's probably, close to time to wind down, but just one more question from the chat before I get some concluding thoughts from both of you. Another theme that keeps coming up in the chat is this, role of like the volume of products that companies make, or the overproduction that some of these companies engage in. Why is that not part of our consideration set here? Or is it even accurate to say that we haven't considered that? Because, one person has said none of these data points addresses the enormous volume that brands produce. How do we get around that? Is that something our index has tried to address, or is it addressed in some way, or is it some feedback that we should take on board for the future?
I think we don't address it directly, asking, are companies reducing the volume of products that they manufacture? That is a really interesting question that we should definitely consider incorporating for the future. Honestly, and I would need to double check this, either none or only a very small number of the companies disclose their production volumes. So the best you can look at as a proxy is revenue numbers, but that's not a good proxy because obviously you're looking at companies with vastly different price points. So it doesn't tell you a lot about production volume. So it's partly just a fact that is not an easily accessible data point.
Yeah, because if LVMH, for example, disclosed, everyone thinks of LVMH as a luxury company, but if then they disclose that they make millions of bags every year, which is probably right.
Yeah.
It becomes very clear that this is a mass production company. It's luxury insofar that, the price point is luxury and the materials are luxurious, and it's made in a way, that perhaps it delivers a higher level of quality than something you might get in a Zara store. But it really brings home the fact that these are the 30 largest publicly traded companies in the world, and they're all operating at a scale which is enormous, right? And so it's an interesting point, and thank you for the feedback in the chat about that. Before we conclude for the day, maybe Diana, Sarah, any final thoughts on where you think the levers for action are? Where should the industry go from here? Diana, let's start with you.
Sure. And before I pick up that, I just wanted to add one thing about the overconsumption point, because that there is a target under our waste category, which is about waste-free production by 2030. So that is something that we have asked a number of binary questions towards the companies. However, just kind of going back to the conversation we were having earlier about how overconsumption and discounting and waste is pretty much built into the industry. So in terms of target setting, there wasn't a single company that had even set a target that they want to be completely waste-free by 2030. So clearly a long way to go, but it is something that is already being tracked in the index. But just going back and kind of reiterating what Sarah was saying, it is very difficult to track in the first place because not many companies want to talk about this because it is pretty much at odds with the fundamental business model. So there are a lot more things that need to change, but it is something that that we have considered. And in terms of overall takeaways, I hope we've hammered home the point now that there is significant amounts of progress that have yet to be made, and really how in order to reach the 2030 goals, we need to significantly increase that pace of progress, because right now that incremental progress we see of +5 points between the companies that were part of the 2021 index and that also appeared this year, that's not enough. That's just kind of the hard, ugly truth of it. And so in terms of the things that companies can actually do, I think, Sarah, that's probably something that you're going to be talking a lot about in the master classes as well. And Sarah has also mentioned that there are 5 key focus and opportunity areas. And so I wanted to turn the table over to you.
Right. So I think we see, five levers in the coming months or year and a half or so. One, as we mentioned, is regulation. The second is really drilling more on the side of transparency. We need, to what we just discussed around HIG and the paucity of data that we have. We need better data. We need to be able to understand what is happening in order to really understand where the opportunities to do better lie. That doesn't mean that without full transparency, we shouldn't act. We absolutely should, but that needs to continue to be a focus. We need stronger partnerships between the different parts of the supply chain within the industry to enable some of the challenges we've been talking about around workers' rights to be unraveled. We need real focus on pricing so that companies are being responsible in the way they buy from others within the industry. And we need more money going into really a lot of this comes down to money. There needs to be real investment behind these goals that companies are setting to enable them to reach them. And if that doesn't happen, it's, nothing's going to change.
Okay, well, this is only the second year of what I hope will be a regular annual index for BOF. Sarah and Diana, thank you so much. I wanted to conclude with some final thoughts for all of you. We at the Business of Fashion created this index in order to provide a measurable resource for the companies and executives and everyone who works in the industry. I have, of course, seen the feedback that you're finding the price of the report in some cases hard to afford. So in the time that this conversation has been happening, I've been liaising with our team at BOF Insights. We're happy to provide a 20% discount to anyone who's joined the chat today. And the team is going to share the discount code as well as a link to download the report. But on top of that, we've done this session as an open session, freely available to anybody who doesn't have a membership to BOF, who hasn't downloaded the report. We're doing this as a service to all of you so that we can give some insights into the report. I also want to share that if you're interested in following the sustainability topic in the coming weeks, we will be doing future master classes on the sustainability index. The first one will be focused on the supply chain. The second one will be focused on how fashion should invest for the future, to that point that Sarah was just making, that the industry needs to invest. And then the third will address this very, very important topic of greenwashing, which is like, how can fashion communicate about sustainability with credibility? And if you want another free resource, please follow Sarah's new weekly sustainability briefing. We'll share a link to that in the chat as well. You'll be able to get inside the head of one of the leading voices in our industry on the sustainability journey that the fashion industry has to take. This is a super important and interesting briefing that will come out every single Friday through the voice of our Chief Sustainability Correspondent, Sarah Kent. So the team will share a link to that. And why don't we do this for those of you who might not have been able to join today for the full session? We will be making this chat, this conversation available for on-demand viewing on our Brand Live platform. And we'll also share the slides that Diana has shared with us on screen today and a couple of other resources so that at least we can give you some of the value created by the index free of charge. But I'm sure you all understand, as some of you have also pointed out in the chat, that the Business of Fashion spent more than a year working on this index. We are also a business, and in order to be able to create and deliver this kind of content, we have a business to run as well. So I hope that you appreciate and understand our perspective on that as well. So again, a special 20% discount on the report using the code in the chat, BOF Insights _Sustainability Index _20. And a very, very big congratulations to Sarah and Diana and the entire BOF Insights team for all of this work. I'm super proud of all the work that her team has done on this. And thank you for joining us today from all around the world. I'm Imran Ahmed, and farewell for now from London.